Well, last week we were in our study of the Ten Commandments. We're going to continue on today. Last week we looked at the first commandment. All right, the first command out of the 10 was that you shall have no other gods before me. That was the command that we heard. If you missed that message, I want to encourage you to go back because it talks about the God who speaks and the God who names himself, the God who defines truth by his word. And that we are called into a relationship, a covenant relationship with a God who loves us and communicates to us and makes himself known to us. I would encourage you to go back, listen to that if you haven't heard it already. But today we're going to get into the second commandment. That's what happens when you go through the Ten Commandments sequentially. I bet you can guess what's happening next week. Yeah, we're going to have the sixth, and then we're going to jump. Today we're in the second commandment, which is going to be found in Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing a steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. This command is simply, you shall not make for yourself. That's what the command is. You shall not make what? You shall not make something that is a representation, an idol. We usually say it's the second commandment says it's a prohibition against idols or idolatry. I've heard a lot of sermons in my life, a lot of teachings in my life about idolatry and the second commandment. It's something that usually is a great sermon that people love to preach, right? Usually the teacher, preacher, whoever's doing it, gives some powerful discourse on how in our lives we are just filled with idols everywhere we look. Under every rock there's an idol in your life. Your house could be your idol. Your car could be your idol. Your wife, your husband, even your church could be your idol. You've heard that sermon? You know why it gets preached so much? Because it's fun. As a preacher, it's fun. It's emotional. It's confronting. And it makes people nervous. And they begin to look at themselves differently. And they begin to think, well, maybe my wife is an idol. Well, that's not what we're going to do today. That's not how we're looking at this particular command, because I am pretty sure that if Moses heard a preacher preach that message, he would walk right up and slap that preacher in the face. Most of the things that often get thrown out there as, hey, watch out for these could be idols, most of those things are misplaced priorities in our life. Right? They're things that are they're not in the right spot. We need to readjust our priorities, or they're temptations that will lead us to a place of sin or rebellion if we don't address them. And while extremely important, and in our church we talk about the whole counsel of God, so we talk about sin and repentance, we talk about getting our priorities right, none of those things are actually idolatry. Okay, so here's what idolatry is. Right? Idolatry is the replacement, right? The replacement of the one true God with anything else. A replacement. When we knowingly worship something that isn't God as though it is God. That's what idolatry is. You can love sports. I mean, today's going to be a great day if you're into football, all right? You're going to love sports. You can love cars. You can love your boyfriend or girlfriend. You can desperately want a new job. You can be interested in all kinds of things in life with extreme passion, and yet not replace God with your boyfriend. I mean, he's cool, but you know he's not God. Right? You know that. That's what we need to really get our head around. The Ten Commandments talks about those problems, right? The 10th, the very last of the Ten Commandments, talks about covetousness, envy, lust, a desire for the things of the world rather than the things of God, right? So it's included, it's in there, and I would not want to lower, right? I just want you to hear this. I don't want to lower worship to the place of lust, right? Lower worship into the gutter of greed. Nor do I want to lift up covetousness to where it can somehow or another replace what you and I do as we respond to the one true God with true passion and worship and praise. Idolatry is when the creation, that's us, when we seek to replace the Creator with something of our creation. That didn't work, right? It's a creation sandwich. It doesn't happen. So let me show you what real idolatry looks like today. We're gonna get a real example, and you're gonna see there might be a difference between real idolatry and getting your priorities wrong. So I want you to think back. We've been talking about the Hebrews, the people that are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they found themselves in Egypt. They were captives there. And God called two of his people, called Moses and he called Aaron, to go and be his mouthpiece. The God who speaks called his people out of Egypt. He confronted Pharaoh and the people that were keeping them captive with a series of challenges or acts of discipline or judgment known as the plagues. You know how many there were? There's 10. You know how many commandments there are? Oh my gosh, it's almost like they're the same. There's 10 plagues. You remember the first one that turned water into blood? Then the flies, then the hail, and frogs, death of livestock, locusts, gnats. That one was crazy. Boils? I'd be like, you guys are out. Then came darkness. The whole land was said to be dark, and no matter what you did to try to counteract, no matter how big the fire was, you couldn't see it. It gave off no light. And then the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn of all who were not included in the blood of the Passover. It was a massive movement of God. And here's the amazing thing. The people of Israel, the children of God that were in this place of captivity, they could see God at work in all of these plagues. While it was dark in Egypt, it was dark in Pharaoh's house, where there were frogs and gnats and boils all across Egypt. In Goshen, the land where the Israelites lived, the lights were on, they were bug-free, and no frogs. Well, at least not unusual frogs. They could literally see a difference. God was carving them out of this wider society and pulling them into a relationship with him until the point where he brought them out of Egypt. He called them out and let them walk across the Yom Suf, the Sea of Reeds, and they went across that on dry land. And the water that was piled up so that they could walk past it crashed down on the army that was pursuing them, stopping their opponents. Then they went on to see with their own eyes, to see the very presence of God day and night. By day, there was a pillar of cloud over them. By night, a pillar of fire, so that they always knew that God's presence was amongst them. They got hungry, and God fed them every morning with manna. They wanted meat. He flooded them with quail. They complained about not having water, and they got water from a rock. Not Iraq, a rock. Last week we talked about how these same people who had seen God at work, they were brought to the edge of the mountain of God, Mount Horeb. And in that moment, when they heard the voice of God, but prior to that, they saw that fire descend on the mountain. They felt the earthquake. They heard the trumpet sound, and they heard the very voice of the living God speaking to them. That's not all. I want you to hear another, this might be the greatest thing that has ever happened to anybody in the Bible that I know of. This is found in Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. I want you to hear this. This is incredible to me. If you didn't know this was in the Bible today, you get something cool. It says, "Then Moses took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Verse 8, then Moses then took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel. See the scene, all right? So 74 of them, 74. They got the elders, got these 4 leaders. In verse 10 it says, "And they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli," which is a blue gemstone, as bright blue as the sky. Okay, so Exodus 24, verse 11. If you've got a Bible and you're looking at it, you might want to circle this. This is incredible. This is something that you may not even know existed. It says, "But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites." Why would he? Because they were seeing God. It says they saw God and they ate and they drank. They saw God and they broke bread with him. They had a meal in the presence of the Lord. They went up into the presence of God. They saw the glory of God, and he invited them in to stop and stay a while, have a meal together. They ate and they drank with the Lord. As a side note, God uses food, right? I know that's probably part of our problem as Christians. When you look at your waistline, you're like, I know God uses food to draw his people together, but God uses food. He uses eating as part of a way to help us to see what our relationship with him is like. It's sitting around a table, it's fellowship, it's inclusion, it's relationship. When Jesus Christ, the resurrected Christ, appeared inside the locked upper room, his disciples saw him, and some of them, it says, thought he was a ghost. They freaked out. They're like, it's a ghost. And Jesus, just kind of, I imagine, chuckled, because I would. And he said, "Let's eat." And they sat down. They had a meal together, demonstrating his actual physical resurrection, his glorified nature and body. God uses this kind of sitting and eating and joining together as a way to help us see that this isn't a dream. It's not some vision. These guys didn't just imagine seeing God. They were in his presence. They saw the glory of the Lord. And they had an opportunity to stop and to break bread with him. So let me just recap what these incredible leaders and Aaron and his other leaders of Israel, what they saw so far. They saw the Exodus. They went through the plagues. They saw God at work. They saw the pillars of cloud and fire by day. They were fed by God every morning. Manna new every morning. They were given meat to eat and water to drink. They saw the glory of the God they served on the mountain. They saw the fire. They heard the trumpet. They heard the voice of God. And the 74 were invited into the very presence of God and shared a meal with the Lord. I can't imagine a more transformative, life-changing experience. Could you imagine? I mean, could you just put yourself in their shoes? You go from being a slave, hearing about this guy Moses, he's talking about this God, next thing you know, all this crazy stuff happens, and boom, here you are at the mountain of the Lord, and you are seeing the presence of God, and you are hearing his voice, and your leaders are in the presence of the Lord God Almighty. After this, Moses is called up, further up the mountain, and he spends 40 days and 40 nights with God. And in that time, God teaches him about the covenant. He teaches him about the law and the instructions that he's to give to the people. When Moses is coming down the mountain after this incredible thing, this should be their crowning achievement, the greatest thing that has ever happened. God wrote on these tablets. They've heard his voice, they've seen his glory, and he wrote them a love letter. And Moses was carrying these tablets down the mountain. And in this moment, I want to remind you what Moses came back to. This is in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, so within that 40-day period, they gathered around Aaron, that's Moses' brother and the high priest of Israel, and they said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they had handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to Yahweh, to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings, and afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. This is idolatry. You want to know what idolatry looks like? That's what it looks like. You literally take something that you make with your own hands. You cast it, you form it, you give it a name, you put it up on a little altar that you build with your own hands, and you say, "This is your God." That's what it looks like to engage in idolatry. 40 days, right? That's all it took. It didn't take generations. It didn't take hundreds and hundreds of years for the people to drift to a point where they were willing to turn their back on the one true God and to follow after false gods. 40 days is all it took. Within 40 days, Aaron, the brother of Moses, the mouthpiece of God, the high priest of Israel, the man who had been with the elders, who had been in the presence of the living God and had a meal with him, as you were walking down the mountain. Imagine this. Imagine walking down the mountain with Aaron. Right? After all that experience, you're walking down and you're like, "Brother, wow. Tell me, Aaron, what is the absolute last thing that you would ever do?" I mean, tell me, Aaron, hey, just think about it. What was the last thing you would ever do on this earth? And Aaron would say, "Worship another god." Right? After having seen the Lord and had a meal with God, and after all that he's been through, he would never agree to turn his back on the Lord. Now scratch that. The very last thing that he would ever do would be to create something with his own hands and set that up in front of the people of Israel and say, "Forget the Lord, this is Yahweh." That's the last thing he would ever do. And that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what they all did. Why? I mean, think about that. Why? You have to ask yourself, what's wrong with those people? Why did they do that? All right? Why does this happen? The answer is it's hard to get your head around. All right? These people agreed together to take their jewelry. All right, everybody in here, take off your earrings, put them in the bucket. It's going to come around in a minute, and at the end, we're going to do something crazy. We're going to make our own God. And they all said, "Sounds good. We're on board with this." And when they presented to them this golden calf and said, "Now this is Yahweh, this is the God that brought you out of Exodus," they all were like, "Yep, sounds great. I'm on board with this." Why would they have done this? So I've done all kinds of weird, nerdy research. I've read through all these examples of ancient Near Eastern gods from the Bronze and Iron Age, and looked at the Egyptian examples of how they worshiped gods that were in the shape of animals and celestial beings and all kinds of elements of the moon, sun, and stars, all of those things. And no matter what you do for research and background, you find some cool stuff, interesting things, and yeah, there's maybe something to do with this calf having something to do with the year in which it was, blah, 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 who cares? At the end of all of that study, the answer to why did they do this? The answer is because they did not like the way that God presented himself. They didn't like the way that Yahweh presented himself as the I am. He is the existent one. He is formless. There is no image for you to worship. There is no place for you to go. There is no cave in which you throw your firstborn. There is no place where you bring him food. You don't have to look after his needs. He is self-sufficient. He is all-powerful, and he doesn't need you. And they didn't like that. They didn't like this God without form, without image. Yahweh presents himself as the I am. He is the existent one, the one who is. He doesn't need us. He created us with a thought. We exist because he wills it. And he chooses to be in relationship with us. He chose to be in covenant relationship with his people. He called them out of their place of captivity, and he welcomed them into relationship. He didn't ask anything of them except for faith. Would they listen? And would they follow him? Would they believe him and walk with him? These people were coming out of a world in the ancient Near Eastern time where everywhere you look, in Mesopotamia and Egypt and around the world, in the Cretians and Minoans, all those guys, they were all, every single version of any deity that you can think of is tied to an image, is tied to a form of some kind, whether it be an animal, or whether it's a physical cylinder shape, or whether it's a star, or it's Pharaoh himself, or an animal of some kind, or a popular person. All of their experience with worshiping God had a God that they could kind of handle. In fact, it had a little thing that they could just sort of carry around. They could put it in their bag. They could leave and carry their gods with them. All those other gods are kind of manageable. Right? They're doable. They're approachable. They need you. You have to give them food. You have to satisfy them. You have to do things in a temple, or they'll be mad at you and you won't be able to eat next year. So they liked that rhythm. But here comes Yahweh, the I Am, who presents himself as the God of creation, the God of covenant, and he doesn't have any of that old form, any of that old color, any of that old shape, and instead he presents himself as the God of creation. He's not raw like the sun god and the physical form of Pharaoh. He's not a bird or a sphinx or whatever, the little alligator thing that goes like that. I mean, he's none of the things that these people were used to seeing in their sojourn and their time in Egypt. How did God reveal himself? How did he describe himself? He is the God who speaks. He is the God who acts. He is the God who leads. He's the God who rescues. He is the God who intervenes. He is the God who hears. He is the God who is present with his people, who feeds his people. He's a God of action and presence. It's all about who he is, not about what we do in response. Yahweh presented himself, God presented himself in a form that was too abstract, too hard for people to get their head around. And so because it was too abstract, it was too formless, there was no image, they decided to create something. They created this calf. I don't think that Aaron or anybody was fooled by what they did. I don't think any of them actually thought that this piece of gold was the actual God who brought them out of Egypt. He made this little thing, and he put it on a plinth. He put it out in front of them, and he said, now this is Yahweh. Let's worship Yahweh. Why did he do that? Because they wanted a God that they could hold. Right? They wanted something manageable. The reason why I've chosen to talk about idolatry this way today and not to do the familiar thing where I'm going to ask you to search yourself and find anything that competes with God and name that as an idol and destroy it is because we have actual competing gods in our world today that are drawing our children away from the faith, that are drawing our adults and our grandparents away from the faith. And when we pretend like everything is between our ears and everything is individualized, everything is about me, and we don't stop and realize that there are all of these alternate versions of God that are being presented to us on a regular basis through TV, media, through what we see in our political leaders, what we find in science and and all the stuff that's happening all around us, when we don't realize that these are alternate gods being presented to us, we're likely to slip. We are likely to fall into the same trap that caught Aaron, the high priest of Israel. Am I better than the man who sat and ate a meal with the living God? Heck no. But when you take your eyes off of the truth, when you stop seeing the God who is, who defines himself, who defines what is right and true, who provides for you what is right and wrong and what is actual, then we begin to buy into the idea that there are gods that we can hold on to that are a little more manageable, a little easier to deal with. These gods around us, they're of our own making. We want them. We're no different than the people of Israel. We struggle with the fact that God is beyond us, that his thoughts are not our thoughts, his ways are not our ways, that his ability to know and understand the future while also allowing you free choice, that these are things that we can't grasp, and so we want to shove God aside, and we want to cast aspersions at the Lord, and we want to say, well, I can't believe in a God who would do whatever. We create an alternate version of God that is ours. I mean, would you worship a God that you made? I mean, would you sacrifice to a God that you made? That is of your own thinking, that is something that you've accepted? I've been reading a lot on the internet, and I've been on this Reddit post for a long time, and I believe this is probably true about God now. Would you give up your life? Would you shed blood for a God that is so small you could put him in your pocket and carry him around? We do have a fight in front of us today. If you don't want to see your grandchildren and your children and the people around you and your neighbors, if you don't want to see them give up on biblical Christianity and turn away and to seek out the gods of this world, then you need to acknowledge that they exist, that there are alternatives, that there are idols, that there are forces at work that are trying to pull us away from the one true God who defines himself. We're in a fight for truth. Who gets to define that truth? The new gods all around us, they look a lot like the old, right? They have the same texture and form. Americans love creating new religions. We're the best at it. You're like, yeah, America. Of course we're the best. We do. We generate new religions and new cults and new philosophies and new ideologies and new things that are counter to the truth of God on a regular basis. We are a factory for idolatry. When will it stop? Well, when we go to heaven, for sure. When Jesus has had enough of it and he ends the experiment. Lord, let's go. The second commandment, what is it about? It's a challenge. It is really challenging. It's a call for us to make a decision about the God that we serve, the God that we believe in, the God that is true. Will we listen to the gods of the people around us? Will we listen to the God of evolution? Will we listen to the God of a woke ideology? Will we listen to a God of our political leaders? Because they're more manageable. And they kind of look like me. And I'm more comfortable talking about that God because it's not offensive anymore and it doesn't hurt someone else's feelings. And now my God kind of fits into my culture a bit better. As a people, we are searching for a new God all the time. A God that isn't embarrassing, that doesn't harm, doesn't grate, doesn't challenge us. A friendly, happier version of God. That's not the God of covenant. I'm going to close by pointing you to one passage. This comes again out of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 23. I'll give you a second to go there because it's so important. He says, be careful. Be careful not to forget the covenant the Lord your God made with you. Do not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything the Lord your God has forbidden. Why? Why not? Verse 24. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Creation cannot replace the Creator, but we will try. It's in our history. It's who we are. A lot of you right now, you're probably thinking, Ryan, this message was not for our church. We're not in that situation. We're not facing any sort of competition to the one true God in our lives. Again, I just point you back to, are you better than Aaron, the high priest? Have you seen the fire? Have you heard the voice of God? Have you seen his glory and sat with him and had a meal in the presence of the elders of the people and enjoyed fellowship with your Creator? Because he failed. Are you better than Peter, the apostle, who said that he would rather die than turn his back on Jesus, and yet that's exactly what he did? We're not better than anyone else, and we are all capable of failing and falling. It's a slippery slope out there. Once we begin to redefine God by our image, in our morality, using our right and wrong, and expressing that and overlaying it over God and listening to other people explain how the biblical God isn't really saying what the Word says, that he isn't actually the person that he's revealed himself to be, but instead he's something else, we start to slide into a place that leads us to exactly where they were, looking at that lump of gold that came off of their ears and saying, okay, I'll go along with you, as long as it's a good party. I want to challenge us this morning in a time of prayer to allow the Lord to look deep into, what are we holding dear? What stands in real competition to the truth of God's Word and the presence of God in our lives? Not your misplaced priorities. Where are you allowing the world around you to change the definition of who God is? Let's go into a time of prayer.